It started with something small, at least, that's how I saw it. I had parked my truck on the street in front of my own house. Nothing fancy, nothing unusual, just a truck sitting at the curb. But the HOA didn't like it. They said it was unsightly, that it didn't belong in the community. I ignored their little warning letters, because at the end of the day, it was a public street. Then one evening, I came outside to flashing red and blue lights. The cops, the HOA had actually called the police on me for parking in front of my own home. The officer shrugged as if even he couldn't believe it, but the message was clear. They were escalating. The humiliation stung more than I admitted at the time. Neighbors came out of their houses to watch as the officer explained complaints had been made. Kids were pointing, adults were whispering, and there I was, treated like some criminal over a parked truck. I moved it to avoid trouble, but inside, something burned. It wasn't about the parking anymore. It was about the principle. They wanted me to bow, to obey, to fall in line like some soldier in their little private army. That night I lay awake, replaying the flashing lights in my mind, and I made a promise to myself. If they wanted to play games, I would play too. The next morning, I walked outside and saw something that made me laugh. 2 HOA board members had their shiny SUVs parked slightly crooked, halfway into the fire lane by the clubhouse. My brain clicked. They wanted to control where I parked? Fine. What if I controlled where they parked? That was the seed of the idea. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted to flip the entire board's smug sense of authority upside down. And as the thought grew, I realized I had the perfect tool for it. Not a lawyer. Not more arguments. No, I was going to fight their parking war with something far heavier. A tow truck. Buying a tow truck wasn't as hard as you'd think. A friend of mine who ran a small repo business knew a guy selling one cheap. It wasn't pretty, but it was powerful. Rust around the edges, paint faded, but that winch worked like a charm. When I first sat behind the wheel, I felt unstoppable. I practiced in empty lots, backing up, hooking cars, lifting them clean off the ground. Every time I heard the chains rattle and the hydraulics groan, it was like music to my ears. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was my rebellion, my weapon, my way of reminding the HOA that I wasn't some weak pushover. Buying a tow truck wasn't as hard as you'd think. A friend of mine who ran a small repo business knew a guy selling one cheap. It wasn't pretty, but it was powerful. Rust around the edges, paint faded, but that winch worked like a charm. When I first sat behind the wheel, I felt unstoppable. I practiced in empty lots, backing up, hooking cars, lifting them clean off the ground. Every time I heard the chains rattle and the hydraulics groan, it was like music to my ears. This wasn't just a vehicle. It was my rebellion, my weapon, my way of reminding the HOA that I wasn't some weak pushover. Word spread fast. Over the next week, I watched their hypocrisy crumble. Every time one of them parked wrong, blocking a hydrant, taking up 2 spaces, leaving their car overnight where it wasn't allowed, I was there with my truck. SUVs, sedans, even the Treasure's minivan, all hauled away. The HOA started panicking. They called emergency meetings, wrote new notices, even tried calling the cops again. But this time, the officer laughed. If your cars are in violation, then they're in violation, he said. Nothing illegal about a tow truck. The same authority they had used to humiliate me had slipped right through their fingers. Funny thing happened after that. Neighbors who had once whispered about me started cheering me on. People who had been bullied by the HOA for years suddenly felt a little lighter. They'd bring me coffee in the mornings, or tip me off when a board member's car was illegally parked. Kids on bikes would chase after the tow truck, laughing and clapping when another shiny vehicle was hoisted into the air. For the first time, the power in the neighborhood wasn't flowing from the HOA boardroom. It was rumbling down the street on my flatbed. Of course, The HOA didn't give up easy. They tried sending me official letters, demanding I stop. They threatened lawsuits. They even tried banning tow trucks from the community. But it was too late. The balance had already shifted. Every time they tried to push, I pushed back harder. And then came the breaking point, a neighborhood vote. The community gathered, tired of the board's bullying, tired of the double standards, tired of the endless harassment. And in one night, with one majority vote, the entire board was dissolved. The people they had called violators and troublemakers were now the ones cheering in the streets. Now, when I park in front of my house, no one says a word. The tow truck sits in the driveway like a monument to resistance, chains still rattling with the memory of every car it carried. The HOA thought they could embarrass me with sirens and flashing lights, but all they did was light a fire. They wanted me small. They wanted me silent. Instead, I became louder, stronger, heavier, iron and steel rolling down the street. And the lesson I carry forever is this: sometimes the best way to fight their rules is to use their own game against them. They called the cops on me for parking, so I bought a tow truck. For weeks after the board dissolved, there was a strange kind of silence in the neighborhood. Not the fearful silence the HOA used to enforce with fines and threats, but the silence of peace, the kind that comes after a storm. People parked freely, decorated their yards, and walked their dogs without glancing nervously over their shoulders. The street felt alive again, buzzing with freedom in ways we hadn't seen in years. And every time I looked out my window and saw my tow truck resting there, I knew that silence wasn't an accident. It had been earned. It didn't take long for the story to spread beyond our community. Friends from other neighborhoods called me, laughing, asking if it was true that I had used a tow truck to bring down an HOA. Strangers drove by just to see the truck that killed the board. Some even stopped to take pictures. My little act of defiance had grown into something bigger, a legend, almost a folk tale, about one person standing up against authority and winning. I never asked for fame, but in a way, it felt right. If the HOA could turn humiliation into a spectacle with flashing lights, then I could turn justice into one with a tow truck. Of course, the old board members didn't vanish quietly. One of them sent me a final letter, hand-delivered, threatening to sue me personally. But when I opened it, I didn't feel fear anymore. I laughed. Their power was gone. Their signatures meant nothing, and their threats had no teeth. The paper that once made me tremble was now nothing more than scrap for the trash can. That was the moment I realized. The real victory wasn't the towing, wasn't the votes, wasn't even the end of the board. The real victory was that they no longer lived rent-free in my mind. I wasn't afraid anymore. Slowly, the neighborhood rebuilt itself into something different, something freer. Without the board dictating every detail, people started helping each other instead of policing each other. When a car blocked a hydrant, a neighbor would knock on the door instead of writing a complaint. When someone left their truck on the street, no one cared. It was just another vehicle, part of the rhythm of daily life. And me, I became less of the troublemaker and more of the protector. People saw the tow truck in my driveway not as a threat, but as a reminder that authority only works if we let it. Now, when I sit on my porch at night, I listen to the hum of the neighborhood. Kids laughing, dogs barking, engines starting as people come home from work. And beneath it all, I hear something else, the echo of chains rattling, hydraulics groaning, steel lifting rubber off the ground. The tow truck doesn't move much anymore, but its spirit lingers like an eternal engine, always idling in the background. That's the legacy it left. Not just a rebellion against the HOA, but a permanent reminder that no one is above their own rules. They called the cops on me for parking, and I answered with horsepower, hydraulics, and the sound of victory rolling down the street. Here's the truth. The tow truck was never just a machine. It became something heavier, something that carried more than metal and rubber. It carried meaning. Every dent, every oil stain, every rattle in the engine turned into symbols of defiance. Long after the HOA's paperwork faded and their threats turned to dust, the weight of that tow truck remained. It wasn't parked in a driveway anymore. It was parked in memory, in spirit, in the story that outlived the very people who tried to silence me. Machines break, engines die, but the weight of resistance, that never rusts. And now, when newcomers move into the neighborhood, they hear the story whispered before they even unpack their boxes. The legend of the guy who bought a tow truck to fight the HOA. Some don't believe it. Some laugh at it. But then they drive past my house and see the truck sitting there like a monument, chains resting, tires cracked, yet somehow alive. It's no longer just my weapon. It's a myth, passed down from porch to porch, barbecue to barbecue, until it feels almost bigger than it ever was. I fought a board, but what grew from that fight was a myth strong enough to outlive me. Sometimes I imagine the old board members still driving by, hoping to catch me slipping, hoping to feel a shred of the control they once had. I imagine their faces when they see that same tow truck, still sitting proud, unchained and unbowed. And I laugh. Not a bitter laugh, not an angry one, but the kind of laugh you let out when you realize you won something so completely that your enemies became irrelevant. They thought they'd bury me under shame. Instead, I buried them under the sound of hydraulics lifting their precious cars into the air. That was the last laugh, and it was mine. Now I understand something I didn't back then. Battles like these aren't just about winning or losing. They're about reminding people that no one, not even those hiding behind bylaws and badges, is untouchable. The tow truck was my reminder, my rebellion, my proof. And though it may one day rust into the ground and fade from sight, its echo will live forever in the stories told, in the courage it sparked, in the laughter it left behind. They called the cops on me for parking, but what they really did was call upon a fire that could not be put out. And long after engines stop and papers crumble, that fire keeps burning, eternal, unbreakable, and loud. Every neighborhood has its monuments. Some have fountains, some have statues, some have plaques mounted on stone. Ours has a tow truck. It doesn't gleam like polished marble or shine like brass. It sits heavy and stubborn, streaked with rust, chains hanging loose, paint chipped from years of work. But it means more than any statue ever could. It's proof that power isn't permanent, that control can be lifted and dragged away, just like a car hooked to steel. People walk by it and nod, as if saluting a soldier who fought a war no one else dared to fight. And in a way, that's exactly what it is. Not just a machine, but a monument cast in iron and memory. The story has grown beyond me now. It's told at parties, passed down to new homeowners, even whispered to kids as a bedtime tale. Not about monsters or heroes, but about an ordinary neighbor who decided not to bow. The tow truck has become bigger than steel and hydraulics. It's become an idea, welded into the minds of everyone who heard it. An idea that says, if they can take your dignity with paper and signatures, you can take it back with grit and steel. That's the real legacy. Not just a truck in a driveway, not just one victory, but the proof that sometimes the loudest engine is the one that refuses to shut off in memory. Here's the truth I'll carry to my last breath. They thought they were calling the cops on a truck. What they really did was summon something far greater, an unbreakable spirit that turned into legend. Long after the bylaws rot, long after the houses are sold, long after my tow truck rusts into dust, the rebellion will remain. Someone somewhere will tell the story again, and the chains will rattle in their imagination, the engine will roar in their chest, and they'll remember that power is only as strong as the silence it creates. I refused silence. I answered with noise. And because of that, the rebellion is immortal. They called the cops on me for parking. What they really did was make me eternal. Freedom doesn't live in paperwork. It doesn't live in signatures or in bylaws typed neatly in black ink. Freedom lives in sparks, the kind that catch when someone refuses to bow. That's what I lit the night I first hooked their president's BMW and dragged it off like dead weight. And sparks don't vanish. They spread. They move from one story to another, from one person's courage to the next. Even now I see it. A neighbor who once whispered now speaks boldly. A kid who once watched silently now grows up knowing what defiance sounds like. That fire didn't die when the tow truck stopped running. It still burns, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next engine to carry it forward. Years will pass. The houses will change owners. The lawns will be cut by different hands. The porches will echo with different laughter. My name might fade. My face might be forgotten, but the story won't. Stories like these are faster than time. They outrun memory. They outlast monuments. People will argue whether it really happened, whether a man really bought a tow truck just to flip an HOA on its head. And some will laugh, but others will lean in and whisper, "Yes, it's true. I heard the chains myself." That's how legends travel, not on paper, but in breath, in whispers, in echoes. And once a story becomes legend, it belongs to everyone, not just me. Years will pass. The houses will change owners. The lawns will be cut by different hands. The porches will echo with different laughter. My name might fade. My face might be forgotten, but the story won't. Stories like these are faster than time. They outrun memory. They outlast monuments. People will argue whether it really happened, whether a man really bought a tow truck just to flip an HOA on its head. And some will laugh, but others will lean in and whisper, "Yes, it's true. I heard the chains myself." That's how legends travel, not on paper, but in breath, in whispers, in echoes. And once a story becomes legend, it belongs to everyone, not just me. So here's my last word, the final truth. They thought I was just one man with a truck. They thought they could scare me with cops, with paper, with rules written to make me small. But I wasn't just one man. I was the fire, the story, the noise that turned into something bigger than all of us. They called the cops on me for parking, but what they really did was write their own ending. Their authority crumbled, their silence shattered, their names forgotten. Mine too, maybe. But the rebellion? That remains. Eternal, unbreakable, carried not on wheels anymore, but on whispers, laughter, courage, and chains that rattle in the imagination of everyone who hears the story. And that is immortality. Even now, when I walk past the tow truck, I don't just see steel and rust. I see a mirror of defiance, a reflection of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be broken. That engine might never roar again, but inside me, it still runs, steady and unshakable. Because the truth is, rebellion doesn't need to keep moving to stay alive. Sometimes it just has to sit there, silent but undeniable, daring the world to forget. And they won't. Not today, not tomorrow, not in 100 years. That's the last engine, the one that never shuts off. So here is where I leave it, where the story truly closes. Not in the heat of a fight, not in the clash of chains, but in the calm that followed. The cops came once with flashing lights, sirens tearing through the quiet night, but they'll never come again. That night was their one strike, and it backfired. The HOA shouted once with papers in hand, thinking ink and signatures could make them gods. But their voices have long since gone silent. Their bylaws turned brittle as dust. What remains now is not their power, not their fear, but the hum of a neighborhood that remembers what freedom feels like. That hum is soft, but it is stronger than any law they ever tried to write. And in that quiet, The tow truck remains, not as a weapon, not as a threat, but as a guardian, resting heavy in the driveway, chains loose but ready, steel weathered but unbroken. It is more than a machine now. It is a sentinel, a reminder that power bends when people refuse to bow. At night, when the streetlights glow and the neighborhood breathes easy, I look at that truck and see something eternal. Not the rust, not the dents, not even the weight of its steel, but the weight of what it gave us. A victory not carved in stone, but in spirit. A rebellion not measured in fines, but in freedom. And as I sit on this porch, listening to the sounds of life, children's laughter echoing through the yards, dogs barking like they own the night, engines starting as families return home, I realize this ending isn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone who ever stood up when they were told to kneel, everyone who refused silence, everyone who chose noise over obedience. They called the cops on me for parking, but what they really did was something they could never control. They gave me forever, and forever is louder than any siren, heavier than any bylaw, and stronger than any board. That is the eternal rest, the rest that comes not from defeat, but from victory so complete it no longer needs to fight.